Well, thank you very much, Your Honor, and thank you, Brother Michael, for this great privilege of paying tribute to our beloved Alan Charles Coors. Alan Charles Coors is our Moses. For 40 years, more than 40 years, we've been wandering in the desert, trying to make our way to the Promised Land, a land of free inquiry, truth-seeking scholarship, and non-indoctrinating teaching. Alan has led us, he has inspired us, encouraged us, exhorted us, supported us, and when we have been a stiff-necked people, reproved and rebuked us. He has led and inspired us by example as well as by precept. Was there ever a more truly independent thinker, a more determined truth seeker, a bolder or more courageous truth speaker, a more dedicated and honest teacher? Certainly not in our time. These virtues are rare in the best of times, and these are not the best of times. And where would we in the higher education reform movement be without our Moses? Although we have not yet made our way to the Promised Land, without Alan's work and witness, without his willingness to sacrifice and even make himself an object of anger and animosity, we would likely not be making our way at all. We probably would have been drowned in the all-too-red sea of toxic ideologies that have afflicted academia since its hostile takeover several decades ago. Now, no one in this room this evening needs reminding that those ideologies are more toxic today than they ever have been. Academia and the broader intellectual culture are full of ideas, or what pass in these sad times for ideas, so inane, so obviously irrational, that they would have been regarded as the stuff of low comedy as recently as 5 years ago. But we provide the resistance, a vital movement fighting back. We're building valuable infrastructure within existing institutions and building new academic and para-academic institutions to replace those that are too far gone to reform. Organizations like ACTA, the National Association of Scholars, founded by the great Steve Balch, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, Heterodox Academy, and the Academic Freedom Alliance are doing the Lord's work. They will be joined soon by the new American Academy of Sciences and Letters. Programs and institutes and whole schools dedicated to academic freedom, to academic integrity, to academic excellence are springing up all over the country at institutions large and small, state and private, religiously affiliated and non-sectarian. So although it still remains distant, we are finally getting at least a glimpse of the Promised Land. Now, I doubt that Alan or I, or perhaps anyone in the room here this evening, will have the blessing of actually entering the Promised Land. If anyone deserves to live long enough to enter it, it is Alan. But I will leave that question between God and him, the two of them having a rather complicated relationship. But I thank God, Alan, that you and I and all of us are getting a glimpse. we know that over the horizon, there is indeed a promised land, and it will be reached and entered. A Joshua of our movement will finally lay siege to the decadent Jericho that is contemporary academia. Although its ramparts seem robust, its walls are in truth thin and weak. The trumpets will sound, and those walls will come tumbling down. And when, my friends, our intellectual descendants enter that land flowing with the milk of intellectual freedom and the honey of scholarly excellence and academic integrity, they will shout and sing of Alan Charles Coors, the visionary, tenacious Moses who led his people through the grimmest of deserts, never abandoning faith in the highest intellectual standards and the noblest moral ideals, never giving up hope, even when our little band of reformers seemed weakest and most vulnerable. For, if I may quote Deuteronomy, no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that he did in the sight of all Israel. God bless you, Alan Charles Coors. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I take as my theme tonight a well-known verse from the book of Ecclesiasticus. Let us now praise famous men and our fathers that begat us. We are here tonight to celebrate the remarkable career of a remarkable man, our guest of honor, Alan Charles Coors. I shall leave it to others to tell the story of Alan's outstanding career as a teacher, a writer, and as a fighter for the free society. Instead, what I would like to do is share with you tonight a few thoughts on Alan Coors, the man. That I should do so is somewhat presumptuous, given that I've probably only been in the same room with Alan on no more than half a dozen occasions. But every now and then you meet someone whose impact on your life is immediate and profound. To meet Alan, even just once, is to be forever shaken from one's dogmatic slumbers. I first met Alan Coors 28 years ago when we were lecturing together one summer at Bryn Mawr College in the summer of 1995. I was just starting out on my academic career, and Alan was a distinguished senior scholar then. The fact is that I did not want to be at this event. My wife had just given birth to our first child only a few weeks before, and I just wanted to be at home with them. I'll never forget that warm summer night when Alan and I sat outside on a picnic table until the wee hours of the morning, drinking wine, smoking cigars, and having an intense conversation about life's most important questions. What I found most remarkable about Alan that night is that he took the time to talk to me about my new son and about the meaning of fatherhood. I barely knew Alan, but he was genuinely happy for me. I could see that. I could see it in his face. At that moment, I saw his common decency, and I was struck by the intensity of his benevolence. He didn't have to do that. He was a somebody, and I was a nobody. And yet he took the time to talk to a young man just starting out on his career as a professor and a father. I've never forgotten what Alan taught me that night, which was that we can all make the world just a little bit better if we take the time every now and then to share in someone else's joy. For that conversation alone, I will always be grateful for Alan's friendship. I should add parenthetically that that baby boy of whom we spoke that night is now himself a young professor and a father of a newborn son. It is my hope that both my son and my grandson will meet Alan or someone like him. For many scholars of my generation, Alan is not only a brilliant scholar, but he is a model of moral character whom we all admire. Anyone who knows Alan knows that he is a moral force of nature. This is the source of his greatness. Alan is first a man of independence. Throughout his career, he always seemed to take the road less traveled, and that seems to have made all the difference. He did it his way, on his terms, and always with honor, even when it hurt his professional career. When I think of Alan, I'm reminded of that line from the film Rob Roy, when Roy, played by Liam Neeson, is asked by his son to define what honor is. And the father answers, "Honor is a man's gift to himself." I'm pretty sure that's all Alan ever needed. He knew he was right, and that's what matters most. I've never met a man as intellectually honest, and sometimes even brutally honest, as Alan. Nor have I ever met a man who has united his moral principles with his moral action as completely as Alan has. If integrity is the principle of being principled, then my friend has it in spades. What separates a real mensch from a mere academic is that the real man not only talks the talk, but walks the walk. And that Alan has always done. And in the light of Carol Hooven's talk this afternoon, I'm tempted to say that Alan squeezed the juice. He drank the juice by gallons, and he liked it. Alan is a warrior. One might even say of him what Herman Melville said of Captain Vere in Billy Budd, that he is intrepid to the verge of temerity. I don't mean that as a backhanded compliment. In an age characterized by academic fecklessness and cowardice, Alan has been throughout his career fearless and courageous. He speaks truth to power. Alan was the man we needed most in the 1980s and 1990s when political correctness and wokeness were coming to dominate higher education. He stood sometimes alone against the forces of academic barbarism, whilst others cowered in the faculty lounge. I do not think, however, that Alan's warrior spirit is driven entirely by what the Greeks called thumos, or spiritedness. To me, Alan's fighting spirit is driven by something much rarer: common decency and a respect for the notion that all men and women should be given the freedom to fulfill their highest purposes, dreams, and aspirations. The acronym of the organization he co-founded, FIRE, might be the best and most fitting way to describe Alan. We might even say of him what was once said of the great abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, that he is a man all on fire for liberty and justice. For those of us fortunate enough to know him, we all know that his moral fire has lit the way for the rest of us. Alan has done something that few can say they've done. He's made America a little bit freer than it might otherwise have been. Like David, he stood up to the Goliath of political correctness, and he won. And if there were to be a Nobel Prize for freedom, Alan would be one of its first recipients. Finally, we should not forget that Alan was never alone on his journey. Standing at his side through thick and thin has been his remarkable wife, Erica. I'm quite certain that Alan would not have been able to accomplish half of his achievements without the love, support, and inspiration of Erica. She loaned Alan to the cause of freedom, and for that we are deeply thankful. The good news is that she can now call in the loan. And so, whatever we say in thanks to Alan tonight, we also say to Erica. I end this testimonial to my friend, Alan Charles Kors, with a personal message from me to him. In the words of Tennyson, "We are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven. That which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." Thank you.
On March 10th, 1762, a 62-year-old cloth merchant from Toulouse named Jean Calas was executed for the murder of his son, Marc-Antoine. According to the prosecutor, the son had been about to convert from his father's Protestant Huguenot faith to Catholicism. And in a fit of rage, the father had killed the son. Jean Calas, however, denied the accusation and persisted into the denial right up to the moment when he was tortured and strangled. The torture was twofold: an 18th century version of waterboarding, then breaking his limbs on the wheel. But after 2 hours of torture, it was observed he neither wavered nor cried out. And his last words were, "I die innocent." There was a sensational aspect to this case, since it began to appear from the start that Jean Calas had been singled out by the authorities not because he was a murderer. He was not. The young Calas was actually a suicide. He was singled out because Jean Calas was a Huguenot. In Toulouse, a Huguenot could not be a lawyer. No Huguenot could be a surgeon, a bookseller, a printer. Word of the case was brought by Jean Calas' other son, Donat, to the famous playwright and essayist, François-Marie Arouet, better known by his pen name, Voltaire. For the next 3 years, Voltaire amassed growing mounds of evidence that pointed to Jean Calas' innocence. And why? You will ask me, perhaps, why I interest myself so strongly in this Calas who was broken on the wheel, Voltaire asked. It is because I am a man. Voltaire had taken as his battle cry in 1759, "Écrasez l'infâme," crush the evil. Crush the evil of bigotry. Crush the evil of organized stupidity. Crush the evil that thinks that power can substitute for truth. Finally, on March 12, 1765, a judicial panel reversed Calas' conviction. Far too late to save his life, but enough to save his reputation. 216 years after l'affaire Calas, a great admirer of Voltaire, which is Alan Charles Kors, found his own version of Jean Calas. which was me. I was a first-year history graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, and perhaps the strangest graduate student the history faculty had ever laid eyes upon. They couldn't pronounce my name either. I came from a small Protestant religious college that none of them had ever heard of, and embraced a Protestant evangelicalism that the other faculty sneered at as fully as Calah's condemners had sneered at his. But when they moved at my first semester review to recommend that I be quietly dropped from the program, since, of a certainty, in their view, I would never fit in their world of higher education, the spirit of Voltaire rose in the words of Alan Coors. "You are religious bigots," he told them. Embarrassed, they shelved their recommendation, and I went the distance to the PhD. I stand before you this evening, not as one broken on an academic wheel, but as one rescued from that breaking by a modern Voltaire, a philosophe. And why? Because he is a man. I stayed with Alan Coors through 2 semesters of his survey of European intellectual history in the 17th and 18th century. To describe his lectures in those old days in College Hall would be like describing life next to a blast furnace. It was a classroom in which Hobbes and Locke, Beccaria and Montesquieu, John Wesley and Pierre Bayle strode through our imaginations as from life. No one could have been further removed in his own mind from John Wesley than Alan Coors. And yet, when he lectured on Wesley in the 18th century, the fires licked around the edges. Alan said, "Witnesses describe Wesley's preaching to the new industrial suburbs, where life is work from dawn till dusk, and where people have been abandoned by the Church of England." I was writing this in words I could barely write as fast as they were being uttered. But into this, Alan said, into this comes Wesley, preaching the love of God, that they are not abandoned, that they have a reward. Yet to the philosophers and scholars, Wesley has a different message. Do you think that the solar system is routine? Then consider the God who made it. At the end, I had but one wish: to teach like Alan Coors, and to teach by his examples, the greatest of energy, the strictest of objectivity. When asked in class what he really thought about Wesley's gospel, Alan replied, "If you can guess what I think personally about any of these issues, I will consider that I have failed." And behind it all rises the figure of Voltaire. The Voltaire who writes against arbitrary authority as the source of wrong, who seeks freedom of thought, of the press, of expression, of conscience, of securing for people the freedom to pursue the simplest tasks of this world, the cultivation of their own gardens. These are the lessons taught by Alan Coors. Lessons that burned their way into my mind, and it is not too much to say that all that I have done in the years since our first encounter, early one morning in the fall of 1978, is the fruit of the trust that you placed in me, a friendless, fatherless boy. Nor was I, in fact, the last Jean Calas whom you rose to defend, as the case of Eden Jacobowitz demonstrated. But the lessons were always the same, and these are the lessons which I now seek to pass on to yet another generation. And to Alan Coors tonight, I say this: écrasez l'enfant. Écrasez l'enfant, mon professeur modèle. Écrasez l'enfant jusqu'à la fin. Thank you.
You're not a typical college audience. I am deeply grateful to ACTA. This award privileges me by placing me in the company of so many heroes of liberty, of decency, and I see in this room as well so many heroes of liberty. It's an extraordinary event for me. In particular, I thank Michael Polyakov for his extraordinary kindness to me and his ongoing contributions to the good cause. And I am overwhelmed and would never know how adequately to respond to those of you who introduced me. But Ravi and Brad and Alan, thank you from the bottom, from the marrow. So let me talk about the last 35 years. Starting in the mid-'80s, I truly thought that I could win. I thought that I would win, that public exposure of the betrayal of liberty and legal equality and privacy on America's campuses would undo the politicized structure of higher education. I just had to make people know what was occurring. I was sure I would win. And with the water buffalo case in 1993, if you don't do it, I've never gotten a royalty, the Shadow University, Chapter 1. With the water buffalo case in 1993, 30 years ago this past spring, I thought I had simply won. The media, down to Gary Trudeau and Doonesbury. Trudeau sent me a full-color original of his excoriation of Sheldon Hackney, president of Penn, of the insanity of speech codes. I thought, I've got Sunday Doonesbury. I've won. The Washington Post editorialized in my favor in the same language as the Wall Street Journal. NBC News gave 10 minutes to the water buffalo case, John Chancellor presenting it as the madness of academics who wanted to police language and deprive us of the most ordinary benefits of plain speaking. On Crossfire, for those of you who might remember, it was the one and only time, the water buffalo case, when Kinsley and Buchanan agreed entirely. And every liberal newspaper in Philadelphia was on my side. The Philadelphia Daily News called the administration at Penn a herd of dick-dicks, violating both the racial and the sexual harassment code. Universities were exposed. Penn was a laughingstock. Trustees met in September and repealed the speech code. Wouldn't the next decades be absolutely grand? Alas, no. I began fighting speech codes, intrusive political training, invasions of conscience, double standards, and kangaroo courts in the mid-1980s, fighting these things at Penn, but talking at colleges and before groups interested in what was happening. I was stunned by the lack of understanding on our campuses among the very people who were living through new forms of authoritarian and abusive control over the life of the mind. In 1980, deciding I had to reach a larger and different audience, I wrote an op-ed in 1989 for the Wall Street Journal. My editorial was about speech codes at Penn and the introduction of racial sensitivity training for student life staff and for defendants in the campus judicial system. In October 1989, about 34 years ago from today, I wrote the following, quote, I now become my co-author of this. The subsidized activists, I wrote, facilitators and social engineers who work in student life and support services are a powerful force in the academic world. They attend conferences together and they testify to each other's successes. They are the expertise that other activist officials call upon to justify with expert testimony their own programs. They share language and conceptual schemes. Culture is not an evolved system that confers survival and life-enhancing benefits upon its inheritors, adapting as material conditions and ways of thinking change, but a system of creating and preserving, quote, hegemonic dominance for white males, end quote. Diversity, and their quote, still my quote, diversity does not mean diverse individuals for them. It is the recognition for them of the primacy of group identity, close quote. I wrote about a brave undergraduate on the planning committee for diversity education who wrote to her colleagues about, quote, my deep regard for the individual and my desire to protect the freedom of all members of society, and still quoting from my 1989 editorial, which led an administrator on the committee to reply to her, the word individual is a red flag phrase today, which is considered by many to be racist. Arguments that champion the individual over the group ultimately privilege the individuals belonging to the largest or dominant group, close quote. I concluded, quote, the practical strengths of such a movement are obvious. The legitimate complaints of truly harassed individuals, the intellectual support for such notions of culture in America within the professoriate, the ability of New Age ideologues to threaten negative publicity and disruption, the radicals' almost uncontested control of moral symbolism. Its moral vulnerabilities, however, are also legion. The Orwellian substitution of thought reform for behavioral sanctions, the desire for essential freedom of speech and expression by professors and undergraduates, if only, the ability of its potential intellectual allies to distinguish between authentic education and tendentious indoctrination, wrong again. The unwillingness of administrators to defend intellectual repression under public scrutiny, and the manifest wickedness of imposing group identities upon the universities of a nation where the right to individuate according to private conscience remains the authentic criterion of liberation. We shall see, close quote. 1989, still waiting. From the 1980s until my last day of teaching at Penn, less than 10 years ago, I framed the issue as a generational swindle. Quote, the heirs of the 60s who run universities today, my talks from the late 90s all through the late 80s all through the 90s, have moved at more and more campuses from their free speech movement to their speech codes, from their struggle against mandatory chapel to their own struggle for mandatory diversity education and sensitivity seminars, from their struggle for racial integration to their efforts for newer forms of separate racial programs. American students are victims of a generational swindle of truly epic proportions. Close quote. I believed that the campus zealots had succeeded in institutionalizing their agenda and their programs, but they had failed to win the students. Too many students remained independent and critical in their thought and values. Most so-called minorities deeply rejected any truly radical politics. Most whites just did not feel guilty about their birth. Women and men, far from perceiving each other as class enemies, continued to fall in love and even write each other poetry, if not collaborations far, far worse. In 1984, there occurred a shift of extraordinary importance in American academic life. Up until 1984, faculty held on to the belief inherent in the culture of the 60s that they were the voice of students, that students were theirs. In 1984, a significant majority of American college students voted for Ronald Reagan. The professoriate looked up with an, oh my God, we have to save them from themselves. We have to save them from American society. And we have to save American society from a generation of our brightest and best that voted for Ronald Reagan. You may date, not political correctness, you may date coercive political correctness, abusive, arbitrary, tyrannical political correctness from that sense of, oh my God, they did what? The 60s were over. Faced with that reality, campus ideologues imposed whole new regimes of intrusive political and cultural inquisition and catechism, which reinforced the agitprop that many students already had been getting from grade school through high school graduation. But think on this. For college students, this was the pinnacle of the educational pyramid. and they assumed that it had all been vetted by the best minds in the country. It all must have been vetted by the best minds at a university. Before you blame students, remember, when they arrive after high school, they're introduced to universities, the lives of the mind, in an orientation that is a political boot camp. But what they hear, they all assume has been vetted by the finest minds in the country. Don't blame students. We have allowed them to be miseducated from kindergarten through PhD by people who loathe this country and its deepest values. In high school, they can be skeptical, right? Mr. X, Miss Y could be wrong. But the faculty of Harvard, the faculty of Penn, the faculty of a place astute enough to admit me, they believe they are being introduced to the acquired knowledge of our society. I was hoping that the split between faculty and students would last until students and their allies demanded an end to the PC tyranny. There was a window from the mid-1980s to maybe 2015 when students, despite a full generation of indoctrination and agitprop in K through undergraduate, were the hope of individualism and liberty in higher education. Those of us who engaged, as did many of you here, had so much success with students, but now the zealots and partisans reap the benefit of what they sowed as lords of the university. Those undergraduates who agree with them reign on our campuses. The independents hear no other voices. The dissidents are terrified or silenced. The despisers have won undergraduate culture, even if they have not won all undergraduates. The worst scenario actually occurred. Indoctrination, political catechism, guerrilla theater agitprop, and incentives to join the woke mob changed their recipients. Think about incentives in a college campus. How much easier to come out on campus sexually than to come out as a classical liberal or conservative, or God forbid, a Republican. I was wrong also, alas, about a deep backlash that I expected long ago, decades ago, warning in 1989, quote, "It will not last. America patiently has subsidized critics who have the utmost contempt for its values of individual identity and individual rights, but it is an utterly absurd supposition that the victims of partisan codes, intrusions of conscience, lack of due process, and selective biased enforcement of campus regulations will acquiesce indefinitely in the double standards upon which their campus legal inequality depends. There will be a day of reckoning, but when it comes, God help us, because where will one then find a broad coalition already formed around the love of liberty, due process, free speech, and legal equality? Where will all our self-proclaimed progressive academics find shelter when those winds blow, after they themselves have attempted to convince everyone who passes through their portals that liberty and legal equality are wholly tactical and dispensable? End quote. That was, in a different piece in 1989, the patience of such long acquiescence in being the victims of double standards is beyond anything I could have imagined, even now, even today, even with the news of the last week. Let me conclude. Our schools have become the enemies of a free society. Stop the subsidies. One may not give in. One may not give up. There always will be alternatives for the kids of parents who know and understand the great moral, political need and task, and the great intellectual need and task is also to create alternatives, school choice writ large, for all the other kids. It is, above all else, our liberty and legal equality that define us as human beings with dignity, capable of morals. The struggle for that freedom in higher education has been one of the defining struggles of the age in which we find ourselves. Whether you would locate a true higher education in the reform of current universities or in new models and venues, do not let that struggle end, and join it with rigor, vigilance, will, and courage. The recovery of liberty and dignity begins with and depends upon the education of the minds and souls of our children. There are no sidelines. And thank you all for being here.